Is this possibly the last time that you're Captain America?
It is.
Bob Iger makes 400 times what his lowest worker is. And I think that's a shame, Bob.
Now at a juncture where I can say no. I don't want to make another...
I don't know. Does anyone want me to do it again?
Asked me to do a season 2, and they offered me half the money. And I'm like, wow, it's going to take me twice the amount of work for half the amount of money.
Black Widow star Scarlett Johansson is now suing Disney.
Natalie AI thing seems utterly preposterous and ridiculous, and even for an MCU show, I'm finding it to be a little bit of a bridge too far to go. The heist crew, all lame. Every single one of them, all lame.
The Avengers aren't battling Thanos, Kang, or even Ultron this time. Their new enemy is far more shocking. It's Marvel itself.
Black Widow star Scarlett Johansson is now suing Disney over the release of the hit Avengers spinoff on Disney+. She says releasing the film on the streaming service was a breach of her contract, allegedly saving Disney and Marvel from paying her what the company would have owed her from a sole box office release.
Lawsuit filed Thursday says, with the bulk of Ms. Johansson's compensation being tied to box office receipts, Disney knew that the cannibalization of such receipts by Disney Plus would save Marvel, and by extension Disney, very large amounts of money that it would otherwise owe Ms. Johansson, adding her team's attempts to reach an understanding were ignored.
For over a decade, these actors carried the studio on their shoulders, transforming superhero films from niche entertainment into a cultural juggernaut. They were the faces on the posters, the icons kids dressed up as on Halloween, and the voices that made movie theaters erupt in cheers. But now, those same heroes are refusing to stand behind Marvel's latest project.
She's practically begging, you know, those folks at MIT, like, dang, like, okay, I may have done some stuff, but let me, like, I can do this.
They're distancing themselves, pulling back, and in some cases, openly rejecting the very company that made them household names. Why? Because Marvel has reached a breaking point. Years of questionable creative choices, strained contracts, and relentless overproduction have left the studio vulnerable. And the spark that set everything ablaze was a project meant to symbolize Marvel's future, Ironheart. Instead of being celebrated as the worthy successor to Tony Stark, Ironheart has become a lightning rod for controversy, fan backlash, and now the silent rebellion of the Avengers themselves. But how did we get here? How did Marvel go from an unstoppable empire to a fractured studio whose brightest stars are walking away? Let's start at the beginning, with a spark that ignited this entire collapse. The story begins back in 2020, during the early days of the pandemic, when Marvel quietly introduced their boldest new project. Dominique Thorne, a rising star, received a phone call that would change her career. Producer Nate Moore asked if she'd take on the role of Riri Williams, better known as Ironheart. The pitch was simple but heavy. She would inherit Tony Stark's legacy, not just as another armored hero, but as the next face of Marvel. From the start, the expectations were sky high. Marvel didn't frame Ironheart as just another supporting character. This was positioned as a generational torch passing. Thorne herself pointed out the symbolism. Like Tony, Riri was a prodigy shaped by trauma, building armor both as a weapon and as a shield. Marvel leaned into this parallel, openly marketing her as the new heir to Stark's empire. It was a risky move, but one they clearly thought fans would embrace. Even Robert Downey Jr., the man who had become Iron Man in the eyes of the world, stepped forward with public support. He delivered a surprise message praising Thorne, but with an undertone that didn't go unnoticed. Half joking, half worried, he asked if Marvel was quietly replacing iconic villains like Doctor Doom with lesser-known substitutes. His words were playful on the surface, but they carried weight. Fans picked up on his hesitation, his subtle doubt in the creative choices being made. That moment, in hindsight, feels prophetic, because while Ironheart's debut in Black Panther, Wakanda Forever generated some curiosity, the standalone series was where things started to unravel. When Ironheart finally premiered, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Critics and fans alike slammed the show for incoherent writing, inconsistent character development, and an overall lack of direction. What was supposed to be Marvel's bold new chapter quickly became its most divisive project, and the release of Ironheart wasn't just a disappointment. It was the match that lit a fuse running straight into Marvel's foundation. Because the backlash didn't stop with the fans, it reached the Avengers themselves. Marvel had seen criticism before. Thor, the Dark World was roasted, the Eternals was divisive, and even Captain Marvel had its share of skeptics. But Ironheart was different. This wasn't just another movie people forgot about. It was labeled by some as the single worst project Marvel had ever released. Reviewers tore it apart. They didn't just call the story weak, they called it incoherent. Riri Williams, meant to be a genius inventor, was inexplicably expelled from MIT for dishonesty. Her inventions, supposedly worth billions, were somehow never enough to support her. Instead, she was written into criminal schemes and questionable alliances. Fans asked if Tony Stark star could fund an empire with a single suit, why is Riri struggling to pay rent? The logic simply didn't hold. Worse still, her morality was muddled. Instead of showing growth from selfishness to sacrifice, the exact arc that made Tony Stark beloved, Riri was portrayed as someone chasing wealth, recognition, and power. At one point, she abandons a man with little remorse. Critics labeled her arc less of a hero's journey and more of a villain origin story. And Marvel's insistence on labeling her a hero only deepened the disconnect. The fan reaction was savage. Online discussions exploded, with some accusing Marvel of hiding behind identity to protect weak writing, while others defended the character, arguing she was being judged by a double standard compared to Tony Stark's early flaws. But regardless of which side people were on, the consensus was clear. Ironheart had failed to unite audiences. And here's where things got even more dangerous for Marvel. The backlash didn't stay contained to YouTube reviews and angry tweets. It started echoing through the industry itself. Critics declared the show a Franken project, the result of too many rewrites, reshoots, and corporate interference. Even Marvel insiders reportedly admitted behind closed doors that it was the worst product the studio had ever put out. At that point, the fans weren't the only ones questioning Marvel's direction. The very actors who had built the franchise, the Avengers themselves, were watching closely, and what they saw was enough to make them take a step back. Because if Ironheart was supposed to carry Tony Stark's legacy, its failure wasn't just embarrassing, it was catastrophic, and the silence of the Avengers cast spoke louder than any critic could. For years, Marvel relied on one simple strategy. When the new projects felt shaky, bring in the old guard. Robert Downey Jr. would show up in interviews to hype the next big hero. Chris Evans would lend credibility with a well-placed quote. Scarlett Johansson, Chris Hemsworth, or Jeremy Renner could appear at a premiere and instantly boost legitimacy. The Avengers weren't just characters, they were the foundation of Marvel's empire, its human safety net whenever the brand seemed to falter. But with Ironheart 2, that safety net vanished. It didn't happen through a dramatic press conference or a scathing open letter. It happened in silence. The actors simply didn't show up. No interviews, no promotion, no carefully worded social media posts. And in Hollywood, that silence is louder than any speech. This wasn't the first sign of tension. Scarlett Johansson had already gone toe-to-toe with Disney over the Black Widow lawsuit, accusing the company of breaching her contract by releasing the film on streaming. The lawsuit wasn't just about money, it was about trust. Johansson admitted later how isolating it felt, but she stood her ground, and the fact that she won sent a message. Marvel's biggest stars weren't afraid anymore. Jeremy Renner, meanwhile, revealed that Marvel offered him half of what he was paid for the first season of Hawkeye to return for a second. He refused outright, calling the offer insulting. For a studio that once wrote blank checks to keep talent happy, this was a startling shift. Renner's response wasn't just about money, it was about value, about Marvel treating veterans as disposable once younger replacements like Kate Bishop were introduced. Chris Evans, long celebrated as Captain America, admitted he was reluctant from the very beginning. His original 9-movie contract terrified him, not because of the workload, but because of the loss of freedom. He confessed that if the films didn't go well, he'd be trapped. If they succeeded, he'd be locked in for years with no escape. Even his acceptance of the role wasn't framed as excitement, it was framed as fear. And then there was Chris Hemsworth, whose journey was defined by years of personal struggle before finally breaking through as Thor. He described the grind, the uncertainty, the sacrifices made long before Marvel turned him into a global star. Yet even he admitted that the non-stop cycle of blockbusters left him questioning whether his creative growth had been stunted. So when Ironheart 2 came along, expecting the Avengers cast to show up and smile for the cameras, the actors collectively said no, not in words, but in action. Their silence was a refusal, a quiet rebellion, a declaration that Marvel could no longer assume their loyalty. And for Marvel, that silence was catastrophic. Because once the Avengers stopped lending their faces and voices, fans began asking a terrifying question. If even the heroes don't believe in Marvel anymore, why should we? But the cracks went deeper than actor disputes. The truth is, Marvel itself had forgotten the formula that made audiences care in the first place. For over a decade, Marvel's storytelling thrived on one timeless idea: redemption. Tony Stark was a selfish billionaire who transformed into the man who would sacrifice himself for the universe. Thor was a reckless prince who learned humility and responsibility. Natasha Romanoff was a spy weighed down by guilt who ultimately gave her life for her family. These arcs weren't just entertaining, they were inspiring. Audiences connected to flawed characters who earned their heroism. But Ironheart, that arc never came. Instead of showing Riri Williams grow into selflessness, Marvel presented a character who seemed obsessed with recognition and personal gain. She wanted money, she wanted status, she wanted the world to see her brilliance. And when the narrative pushed her into questionable choices, theft, manipulation, even leaving someone, there was no redemption, no reckoning, no transformation, just a protagonist who behaved more like an antagonist while still being sold as a role model. Fans noticed, critics noticed, even insiders noticed. They said Marvel had lost the meaning of heroism itself, turning it into a label rather than an earned journey. And without that foundation, the entire Marvel formula started to crumble. The issues weren't limited to Ironheart's character. The entire series was riddled with signs of corporate interference. Plot lines contradicted themselves between episodes, characters shifted motivations without explanation, and the supporting cast felt like caricatures instead of people. Critics described it as a Franken show, stitched together from rewrites, reshoots, and competing agendas until it resembled nothing coherent. This wasn't the Marvel of 2008 when every story felt meticulously planned. This was Marvel in survival mode, throwing content at audiences faster than anyone could process. And instead of building anticipation, the constant churn bred fatigue. Eternals, She-Hulk, Quantumania, all underperformed. But Ironheart was different because it was supposed to be the future. And if this was the future, what hope was left? Worse still, Marvel leaned heavily on ideology to mask weak storytelling. Instead of exploring deep moral struggles, critics argued, the series used identity as a shield. When fans rejected the show, Marvel defenders accused them of bias. But audiences pushed back, saying the problem wasn't race or gender. It was lazy writing. The conversation spiraled into a bad feedback loop, alienating the very fan base Marvel once commanded with ease. And behind it all, the Avengers actors were watching. They weren't blind to the declining scripts, the pay disputes, or the overextended production schedules. They saw the same broken formula that fans were rejecting, and by refusing to stand beside Ironheart 2, they sent a message. Marvel had lost its way. But what came next was even more devastating, because the silent rebellion wasn't just about one show, it was about the studio's identity crisis, and the growing feeling that Marvel no longer respected the very heroes who built its empire. For over a decade, Marvel's strategy was simple: expand the universe, don't replace it. Each new hero, from Black Panther to Doctor Strange, wasn't framed as a replacement, but as an addition. Fans could embrace new characters without feeling like they were being forced to let go of the old ones. It was balanced, carefully managed. But somewhere along the way, that balance collapsed. Instead of growing the universe, Marvel began to swap it out. Tony Stark gone, replaced by Riri Williams. Steve Rogers retired, replaced by Sam Wilson. Natasha sacrificed, replaced by Yelena. Hawkeye passing his bow to Kate Bishop. Thor teased to be sidelined for Jane Foster. Every legacy character was being methodically written out, and their replacements didn't have time to earn audience loyalty. It wasn't organic. It felt like a hostile takeover, and fans noticed. The problem wasn't the introduction of new heroes. Audiences had embraced characters like Black Panther and Spider-Man with open arms. The problem was the forced transition. Marvel wasn't saying, here are more heroes to love. They were saying, these are your new heroes now. Forget the ones you grew up with. For fans who had invested over 10 years into the Avengers, this was betrayal. And the actors felt it too. The Avengers weren't just roles. They were careers, identities, entire chapters of life. Robert Downey Jr. became Iron Man. Chris Evans became Captain America. Scarlett Johansson, after years of supporting roles, finally became a blockbuster headliner through Black Widow. These actors were Marvel, yet the studio's new approach treated them as disposable placeholders, simply holding the seat until the next character arrived. The arrogance of Marvel's leadership only made things worse. They assumed the brand was bigger than the stars, that fans would cheer for any story so long as it had the Marvel logo stamped on it. For a while, that confidence seemed justified, but Ironheart's reception shattered the illusion. Suddenly, the brand wasn't invincible. Audiences weren't automatically loyal, and worse, the Avengers, the very people who had built that loyalty, weren't playing along anymore. This wasn't just a creative misstep. It was an identity crisis. Marvel no longer knew who it was: the studio that gave audiences flawed but redeemable heroes, or the studio that churned out endless replacements, assuming fans would follow blindly. And when the Avengers stepped back, the identity crisis exploded into something bigger: a rebellion. Hollywood thrives on image. When a movie premieres, the actors show up, pose for photos, give interviews, and smile on red carpets. It's not just promotion. It's a show of unity, a sign to fans that the cast believes in what they've created. So when Marvel rolled out Ironheart and its sequel announcements with no Avengers in sight, people noticed. Robert Downey Jr. was absent. Scarlett Johansson stayed quiet. Jeremy Renner declined to return. Chris Evans kept his distance. Even Chris Hemsworth, usually one of Marvel's most loyal faces, avoided attaching himself to the project. Their silence was deafening. And in Hollywood, silence is never neutral. Silence is a statement. Fans began reading into every omission. Why hadn't Downey Jr. said a word? Why did Johansson avoid public comments? Why was Renner outright calling Marvel's offers insulting? This wasn't coincidence. It was coordinated disengagement, a subtle but undeniable rebellion. Think about it. For years, the Avengers were Marvel's best marketers. They didn't just sell movies, they were the movies. Their interviews, their chemistry, their friendships on and off screen created the illusion of a real family. Fans weren't just buying tickets to watch superheroes, they were buying tickets to see their favorite actors together again. That bond was the secret ingredient to Marvel's dominance. But now, that bond had fractured, and Marvel couldn't fix it with contracts or promotional spin, because the truth was simple. The Avengers no longer trusted Marvel. Industry insiders called it the cultural equivalent of a strike. The Avengers didn't need to make speeches or air dirty laundry. Their absence said everything. It was a quiet refusal to endorse a direction they didn't believe in, and the fallout was devastating. Without the Avengers' presence, Ironheart felt hollow. Without Downey's blessing, the attempt to crown Riri as his heir rang false. Without Johansson, Renner, or Hemsworth, the supposed next generation felt disconnected from the legacy that had made Marvel matter in the first place. Fans didn't just feel let down, they felt abandoned. The Avengers' rebellion wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, quiet, and surgical. But in many ways, that made it even more powerful, because by saying nothing, they exposed everything. And Marvel's problems didn't stop there. What came next reached beyond actors, beyond shows, and beyond even the MCU itself. It was a collapse that stretched all the way into the courtroom. The rebellion of the Avengers was bad enough, but Ironheart wasn't just a failed show. It was the domino that tipped an entire line of collapses for Marvel. Because while the actors were quietly walking away, Marvel was battling enemies on another front, the courtroom. In 2023, Disney faced a shocking wave of lawsuits from the families of Marvel's original creators. Names like Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, and Don Heck suddenly returned to headlines, not because of new stories, but because their estates were suing Disney for control of iconic characters. Spider-Man, Iron Man, Doctor Strange, Ant-Man, Hawkeye, Black Widow, Falcon, entire franchises were on the line. If Disney lost, they could forfeit control of the very heroes that built their empire. For a studio already struggling to convince audiences its new generation was worth watching, the possibility of losing the old guard was unthinkable. Disney fought back, arguing the characters were works for hire and belonged solely to Marvel. But the optics were disastrous. Headlines painted a picture of a mega corporation trying to strip families of creative rights. Fans saw the irony. While Marvel struggled to replace its beloved heroes with weaker successors, it was also battling the legacies of the men who created those heroes in the first place. By September 2022, settlements were reached. The lawsuits were resolved, but the damage was done. The illusion of Marvel as a scrappy underdog turned cultural champion was gone. Instead, audiences saw a corporate giant desperate to hold on to power while alienating the very people, actors, creators, and fans who had made it great. And all of this was happening while Disney itself was in chaos. The streaming wars had destroyed profits. Disney Plus was losing money. Theme parks struggled to regain momentum after the pandemic. Shareholders demanded cost-cutting, which trickled down to Marvel's budgets and talent contracts. Marvel, once untouchable, suddenly looked vulnerable. It wasn't just about Ironheart anymore. It was about a studio cracking under the weight of its own empire. And through it all, the Avengers remained silent, watching, waiting, refusing to step in and save a ship they no longer believed in. Because this wasn't just a stumble. This was the slow-motion collapse of an era. The most shocking part of Marvel's downfall wasn't the fan backlash or the lawsuits. It was the quiet, deliberate refusal of its greatest heroes to play along. Robert Downey Jr., who had once given Marvel its crown jewel, kept his distance. Scarlett Johansson, fresh off her lawsuit, never looked back. Jeremy Renner focused on rebuilding his life after his accident, far from Marvel's chaos. Chris Evans found freedom outside the Shield. Chris Hemsworth admitted he was re-evaluating his career. One by one, the Avengers disappeared. Not in dramatic exits, not in scandal, but in silence. And that silence spoke volumes. Fans, meanwhile, connected the dots. They saw a studio once defined by camaraderie now fractured. They saw actors who had once been the most loyal brand ambassadors quietly detach themselves. And they saw a Marvel that no longer inspired. It demanded. The rebellion wasn't about contracts or even about money. It was about respect, about creative integrity, about the feeling that Marvel no longer valued the people who had built its empire. In the end, Ironheart didn't just fail as a show. It exposed the cracks in Marvel's foundation. It showed that the actors were no longer willing to prop up stories they didn't believe in. And it revealed that without the Avengers, Marvel's brand was just a logo, a hollow shell of what it once was. This was the last act of the Avengers, not on screen, but off it. Their final role wasn't to save the world in a climactic battle. It was to save themselves from being chained to a sinking ship. And in that way, their silence became the most powerful statement of all. Ironheart was supposed to be the future. Instead, it became the breaking point. It was the project that revealed Marvel's arrogance, exposed its broken formula, and triggered the silent rebellion of the very actors who had built its empire. It showed fans that the Avengers weren't standing behind Marvel anymore. And if they weren't, why should audiences? This wasn't just about a bad show. It was about an entire cultural shift, the end of an era. The moment the Invincible studio realized it wasn't invincible after all. The Avengers may have saved the world on screen, but off-screen, their final act was walking away from Marvel itself. And maybe, just maybe, that was the one battle they were always meant to win.